Thank you for that introduction. Takes you to get an introduction like that from my father. Thank you. Turns out that Einat, that you're just about as popular as religion. I think there's only 2 occasions you get a crowd like this here: Yom Kippur and Dr. Einat Wilf. So, well done. I think Colin touched on it, but I think it's worthwhile to set the scene for this Q&A with a brief foray into your background, because in a sense I think it reflects the shift in Israeli public opinion and the opinion of many of those in the Jewish community over the last 30 years. You're a child of the left, you were an advisor to Peres, you were part of the Oslo Accord process, and you very much believed in it. So I suppose the question is, can you give us some insights into precisely sort of when and why your views started to shift?
So first of all, thank you, really. This is deeply moving and a great honor, and I'm happy to be here, especially as a guest of AIJAC, who are truly doing tremendous work, so thank you. So my personal kind of reflection and shift begins in 2000. As you said, I grew up with the belief that became associated with the Israeli left in the 80s and the 90s, that the only thing that stands between us and peace is a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, Palestinian control of those territories. I voted for every Israeli prime minister who was going to bring that about, from Rabin to Peres to Barak to Olmert. I supported the disengagement. The 90s were certainly a time of euphoria for me, a sense that really peace was at hand. And like many Israelis, I followed Ehud Barak. This is the moment when things really begin to shift for me. Ehud Barak, an Israeli prime minister from the Labour Party, elected on a platform of making peace, goes to Camp David, which was already symbolic. This is where peace was negotiated with Egypt, and proposes to the Palestinian leadership, to Yasser Arafat, everything that we believed is what was necessary to make peace. A Palestinian state, fully sovereign, bordering on Jordan and Egypt, no occupation, no settlements, capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. Basically, all he had to do was say yes. And I, with many Israelis, watch how he walks away. President Clinton chases after him. He still walks away. Follows that up with a campaign of murderous violence, which some of you will remember. Before October 7th was the darkest time to live in Israel. There was a palpable sense that you were playing Russian roulette with your life if you just went for a cafe. And this was weeks after this proposal was on the table. And I would say that even the fact that he walked away, the fact that he followed it up with violence, is not the most important thing. The most important thing that became clearer and clearer to me with the years is that there were no Palestinian voices that dissented. None that said, why? We were just about to get everything we've ever wanted. Go back there, get it for us. And I saw the same pattern repeat with Abu Mazen and Olmert, with the disengagement from Gaza. We know what they did. So, you know, as I began to write about it and research and speak about it, I've noticed that people have told me something like, you've changed your views. You've changed your opinions. So at one point I began to say, this is not an opinion. I have opinions, quite a few. This is not one of them. It's not an opinion. I sometimes compare it to a scientific process. We had a hypothesis. The hypothesis says, between us and peace stands a Palestinian state or Palestinian control of territory. Then comes the part that people sometimes just ignore. The hypothesis was tested. And because we're good Jewish scientists, it was tested several times in a variety of ways. 2 Israeli prime ministers, Barak and Olmert with 2 different Palestinian leaders. Direct negotiations, unilateral disengagement. We tested it multiple times only to find the wreckage of the hypothesis. So like good scientists, we ask, okay, what other hypothesis explains all the data and evidence? And here, as I know you know, I always bring a quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II. He goes to the British Parliament in February of 1947 to explain why Britain, of all the mandates that it got, the only one that it didn't fulfill is to the Jews. It fulfilled the ones to the Arab, Jordan, Iraq are independent, Syria, Lebanon with the French mandates. The Jews don't have a state, so it's a British failure, and Britain has to explain it. So he goes to the Parliament in February 47, and he says the following: His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, why is this moment so important? This is February 47. In February 47, there are no settlements, there's no occupation, no blockade of Gaza, there's no Bibi, there was such a time, and there's also no Arab refugees, in case anyone sold you a story that the conflict is between Zionism-displaced Arabs. So basically, what's great about February 47, there are no excuses. And already he says that the conflict is irreconcilable. And he goes on to say, Jews and Arabs live in the land. No one, of course, is called a Palestinian at this point. And he says, the most important thing for the Jews, their top priority, is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. Great. The Jews want the universal principle of self-determination. Now they try to present it as ethno-nationalism, but at the time it was just called self-determination for peoples. So the Jews want a state, and then he goes on to say, and for the Arabs, the most important thing, their top priority, those are the Arabs that will later be known as Palestinians, he says their top priority is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. By definition, irreconcilable. He's not saying we have a conflict between two peoples who want a state, Jews and Arabs, and we need some help drawing borders. He says we're in an irreconcilable conflict because one side, the Jews, want a state, they want to be sovereign, and the other side, the Arabs, as their top priority, want to ensure that the Jews have nothing. Recently, I was debating someone in New York, and he told me, Einat, you can't describe this as a zero-sum conflict. I was like, what can I do that the other side wants us to have zero? So it's kind of a problem. But when you understand that this is the alternative hypothesis, the Jews want a state, the Arabs, the Palestinians want the Jews not to have a state, what emerges is that this hypothesis, the Bevin hypothesis, explains all the data. So what I tell people is, it's not an opinion, it's not a view. I tell it through my own personal story, but ultimately, this is evidence.
So that's, obviously the intellectual underpinning and framework of your book. Together, I think, with the other key idea, which is that not only did the Palestinians want to resist a Jewish state, but post-47 to remain as refugees, kind of forever, which is obviously a key part of this whole strategy. And you've commented on this a lot. You've spoken about UNRA, and I just want to sort of develop that idea because it's not only UNRA, but I think you've called it you've described it as the fact that this movement has hijacked institutions of prestige or authority. I think that's how you describe it. UNRWA, the UN, the AIJAC, the Human Rights Commission, and now, of course, our prestigious universities. We've got one or two of those in Australia. And these effectively neutralise people or paralyse their judgment so that they're not actually thinking, they're just sort of not challenging these sort of institutions. So I wonder if you could sort of talk a bit about that And especially for us, I mean, it's a universal problem, but how do you even go about tackling that when people's minds are sort of made up?
So over the years, I followed it up through something that I saw building. And I've come to call it the placard strategy, because you see it in anti-Israel placards very clearly. These placards, for decades now, are very visually simple. They are built like equations, with one side saying Israel, Zionism, or just drawing the Star of David, then an equation sign. And the placard strategy has been so effective and successful that I've yet to see a placard that says Zionism equals the political movement for self-determination of the Jewish people in their historical homeland, which would be the only correct placard, a long one, but the only accurate one, but you've never seen it. The strategy has been so successful that everyone knows what's on the other side of it. Remember the good old days that it was only apartheid and racism? But it's there, right? Imperialism, colonialism, apartheid, racism, then it escalates, ethnic cleansing, Nazism, genocide, Holocaust. If you're in America in 2020, it suddenly said Zionism equals white supremacy, which gives you a clue to how it works. The strategy works by equating Israel, Zionism, and the Star of David, not with words that reflect reality. If anything, they're always the inversion of reality, but because these words are associated with evil. So essentially what people are exposed to is this endless repetition. Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals evil. Now, a few months ago, I saw a remarkable video by someone who was a Soviet operative who explained how you do mass manipulation. I sometimes joke that Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union don't get enough credit for their contribution to global Jew hate. They literally wrote the book. So he talks about how you do mass manipulation. And he said, strong visual symbols, which the placards are, these simple, strong equations, repetition, which is what it does. And then he said something which I thought was key, and you referred to. He said prestige. And he said because prestige suspends judgment, and that is something that is long known. When something has prestige, whether an institution or celebrity, it tends to suspend our judgment. So what the placard strategy very carefully and deliberately did for decades was to launder those equations through our most prestigious institutions. So it's not just in the placards, it's not just in media and social media. I'm sure you've noticed in the media, you give an anti-Israel speaker 30 seconds, regardless of the question, they will say apartheid, racism, genocide, and the answer. I remember even many, many years ago, I was in a panel, and the Palestinian speaker said, no one was dying that year, so he said, Israel's committing cultural genocide. And I remember sitting there and thinking, what is that even? And then I realized it doesn't matter. He just wanted to use the word genocide, in case anyone pretends that it's new, in order to stick it next to Israel. So it's not just the repetition on the placards, in the streets, in media, and social media. It gets laundered through the most prestigious institutions. Zionism is racism, brought to the United Nations in 1975. And again, it's the UN. How many people know that the United Nations General Assembly is one lousy country, one vote? To which Abba Eban, our legendary ambassador to the UN, remarked when he noticed the process happening as the UN General Assembly ballooned. He said that if Algeria, it's still Algeria, he said if Algeria were to bring a resolution to the UN General Assembly that the earth is flat and that Israel had flattened it, it would pass by a majority of 146 13 against, and 26 abstentions. That's still pretty much the ratio. So who knows that, except for a few experts? People just hear the UN said that Zionism is racism. Prestige paralyzes judgment. The whole idea of taking the case of genocide to the International Court of Justice. Who cares what are the legal proceedings, what was actually said? That's it. Now people can feel that they are completely justified in saying Israel and genocide next to each other. And of course, academia. You will get a PhD in Zionism is colonialism. You will get tenured for Israel as an apartheid state. And again, this is prestige. It paralyzes judgment. And it becomes this 360 environment whereby we emerge as the insane ones, right? Because what did I just say? I described a process for decades that spans our most important institutions. That makes me sound insane. What, everyone's in on it, right? I'm sure people that's their response. But yes, it's a very deliberate, powerful strategy that has been building for a very long time. In an essay that I published that described the strategy, I said that about 140 years ago, Ahad Ha'am wrote an essay called Chatzi Nechama, half solace, because he was also concerned the Jews no longer in the ghetto, the walls are down, are surrounded by what he called a general agreement about the evil nature of the Jew. And he feared that they would begin to internalize that this is what being Jewish is. That's 140 years ago. And where did he find Chatzi Nechama, half solace? In the blood libel, the real one. He said, Jews know for a fact that the blood libel is false, is not true. They do not ritually drink the blood of non-Jewish children. He said, Jews know that. So he said, perhaps, where he found half solace, Jews would know, that would give them the backbone to know that it is indeed possible for the whole world to be wrong and for the Jews to be right. And we're at that point once more.
We are at that point once more. I mean, we have a foreign minister whose line that she keeps repeating is, Australia respects international law. We defer to the International Court of Justice. What would you say to her? I mean, there was a scene at Sydney University last week that most of us, that you wouldn't have seen, but there was a Jewish student standing on stage speaking, and everyone turned their back and just faced the other way. They weren't listening. It kind of feels like a metaphor for what we're dealing with. It's Australia, Canada, the UK, our friends. I mean, forget about the collective of despots. I mean, what would you say to her if you had the opportunity? I mean, we know she won't meet you, but...
So I would handle it at several levels. The first one, again, I don't know how open she would be to that, but in general, what my message is, we have wasted too much time in dealing with the individual allegations. No, Israel's not apartheid, right? When I started to notice this phenomenon, I saw that there was this Italian programmer about a decade ago, Brandolini, who coined the Brandolini Principle, also known as the bullshit asymmetry principle. He basically, when he noticed what's happening on the internet and social media, and he said the amount of effort required to kind of dismantle and disprove bullshit is at least an order of magnitude greater than the amount of effort required to produce it. So they just say apartheid, and we now write books and essays, right, Colin? You bring speakers, and you need to explain and look at the Arab judges, and you bring delegations, and we need to do all that work, and they just say one word. And I think I certainly did, wasted a really long time responding to each individual allegation. And what I increasingly now do is I just say, leave the trees, look at the forest. The forest is about building a 360 environment that basically says Israel, Zionism, Starve David equals evil. And after October 7th, a new placard appeared. Because I've been following it for 20 years, I know when something new appears, like white supremacy in America in 2020. And it said, keep the world clean. Apropos Greta now, you know, the language of the environment, yes, kind of keep the world clean. But what the image had was the Star of David, the flag of Israel, in a trash bin. And
it's been our Greens party loves to
here
put that placard
yes.
up. Yeah.
So when I saw that, I remember saying, okay, this is now the culmination of the placard strategy. This is the final placard in many ways, because one of the greatest failures of Holocaust education is that people can know so much about the history and Nazism and the death camps, but very few will be able to crystallize a single idea that everything the Nazis did was downstream of one idea: keep the world clean, keep Germany clean, keep Europe clean. But it's this notion, which is an ancient and dangerous one, that there is a utopia out there, a clean world, and between us and that clean world, that utopia, stands the collective Jew, which has to be rid of by any means necessary. We've heard that too a lot. So to the extent that I have an audience and people willing to listen, I no longer focus on the individual libels. I focus on the forest of look at what's being built. What's being built is an ideology, a mindset that says that there's a utopia. And by the way, I'm sure many of you have noticed queers for Palestine, feminists for Palestine, Palestine is climate change, Palestine is worker rights, and you're thinking, they're morons. What, like, don't they know what's really happening on the ground in that society? But there's actually an incredibly powerful logic here. It's going to sound weird, but Palestine has become the mark of global utopia, which sounds odd until you understand that what Palestine is the erasure of the collective Jew. This is why all the good words are with Palestine. We have all the evil words, the collective Jew, Israel, Zionism, Star of David equals all the evil words. And Palestine is justice, equality, freedom, rights. It's not a coincidence. It's this positing of good versus evil, utopia, getting to the utopia by getting rid of the collective Jew. So first, I would highlight that this is the bigger picture. I would also highlight that wherever anti-Zionism, literally created and invented by the Soviet Union once the Tsarist anti-Semitism was discredited, for obvious reasons, the Soviet Union literally created, after World War II, anti-Zionism as its respectable replacement. And if in the early 20th century one book was enough for respectability, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, it's a book, it's respectable, the Soviet Union created a whole academic discipline, which is then exported. Everywhere, what I tell people is like, you know, leave the hair-splitting debates, is anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism? Let me tell you what happens every place where anti-Zionism becomes institutionalized, legislated, becomes the ideology of a country, of a people, of a political party, of a society. Two things happen. Step one, the environment turns hostile to Jewish life. Even as they claim to love Jews, we have nothing against Jews, Jews are great. The environment turns hostile to collective Jewish life. And if it's not stopped and fought against, ultimately, no Jews are left. Now, here I sometimes feel the need to lighten a bit the mood. When I say no Jews are left, so for example, Iran claims to love Jews, have nothing against Jews. It's only against Zionism, but the Jews are in LA. But the collective community is gone. The collective Jewish community of Venezuela is gone, but they're all in Miami. All I want to say is that when anti-Zionism rises, Jewish collective life essentially becomes impossible. It's not a coincidence that when Australia was at its most Zionist, Jewish life thrives, and when anti-Zionism rises, you begin to feel the pressure. So if I were telling her that, I recommended that, for example, for many young people who went to speak with university administrators. I told them, leave the hair-splitting debate on anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. Let them know that if they're going to allow anti-Zionism to take over their university, they're going to have no Jews left. I had some students come back saying, thank you, this was very effective. And I had some students come back and say, that's what they want. So the question to me would be whether she is the kind of person who would be horrified to know that she's playing with fire and that it's not about international law and all that this ends with Australia not having a Jewish community if she allows this to go to its full logical process. Would she be the kind of person who would be horrified to know that that's what's actually happening? Because if so, then she's an ally and could be made to understand. If she actually wants this to happen, we're in very different territory.
I think we are in different territory, but I'm not going to die wondering. But I'll pick up another point there before we move on, perhaps, to talk about your new book. But Ahad Ha'am's poem, I mean, it actually, when I read your article and I was thinking about it, I mean, we've got this phenomenon today. And it's the phenomenon of the anti-Zionist Jew, the Jew who thinks that they're, going to redeem themselves by publishing articles in the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, which, if you read that paper, you would think represented the entire community. But they would, say we have to dissociate ourselves from Zionism, we have to dissociate ourselves from Israel. Israel's committed the worst crimes of inhumanity that ever existed. I mean, what do you say? I mean, to me, it's a fool's errand. It's complete folly that would help. But what would you say to those people? Because they are increasingly vocal, and they present a problem to us.
Certainly. So, first, I want to say something that might sound odd. Because we've been so successful, both in Israel and as Jews around the world, a lot of people have grown, I think by now at least 2 generations, have grown under the mistaken impression that being Jewish is just really fun. It's just easy, simple, and fun. Someone recently tweeted, if it were not for Israel, being Jewish would be about gefilte fish and small little hats. I love that you call them small little hats. But there's a lot of Jews who seem to think that the fact that the era of the greatest thriving of Jewish life around the world in the West and the existence of the State of Israel happen to be at the same time, think that it's an utter coincidence. Has really, has nothing to do with the other. And as a result, they've really come to believe that being Jewish is this nice, tikkun olam, social justice, lovely, prestigious identity, and Israel is ruining that for them. And they don't have the capacities to deal with the difficulty that has been kind of a pretty constant of much of Jewish life. They actually don't have the skills, the spirit, the capacity, and they wake up and they're like, hey, we signed up for the tikkun olam gefilte fish little hats part. We didn't sign up for the genocidal baby killer part. Like, just, we don't want that. And they really think that what we all had for the last 50, 70 years is the normal. And they don't have the skills to deal. So because they don't want to have the skills, there is massive pressure, always has been. Someone wrote a few months ago, looking at the history, there's a long history of Jews who sold out their people, who were promoted blood libels. Because there is massive pressure for Jews to sell out their people, right? Who debated the Jews in the medieval debates? Converts, right? It was always Jewish converts who debated the Jews. So here it's just a modern, secularized version of that. And this is because they're so valuable, and the more articulate, the more educated, the more valuable they are, Jews who sell out their people will always get a platform, and there will always be those, as you hinted, who believe that they will save themselves by feeding the crocodile last, right? By saying that we are not that kind of Jew. Don't count us with them. Never been a winning strategy, but there's always those who try and who succumb and fall for it. And I sometimes joke that, pun intended, this is kind of our cross to bear, but really at the end of the day, I think the only thing Jews can really make it clear is that they do not speak for the Jewish people, that yes, there will always be those who succumb to the temptations of selling out our people. But what I tell them when I do sometimes occasionally speak to them is they might give you a platform, they might even pretend to like you, they will never respect you. No one ever respects anyone who sells out their people.
I'd like to turn to your book, Shivabo October, and it's a brilliant title for those in the audience who don't speak Hebrew. It's a brilliant pun on the word Shiva. It means both return, so connecting it with your first book, return in October, but it also means the 7th of October. And Shiva, of course, also is a morning, so it's a play on that word. But I just wonder if you could speak just briefly about why you saw the need to publish the book, what it says. You've got it here, and it's only in Hebrew so far, and why it's in Hebrew only and addressed to Israelis, I suppose, for starters.
Yes. The War of Return also came out first in Hebrew because, like Colin said, we wanted to first influence our own government to let them know what was brewing on our borders. The book is indeed called Shivabo October. Shiva is in return, but playing on the sound of Shiva, 7th. And Avram Vovsi, your very own, designed the cover, essentially with a key and a fire. Basically, our editor, our publisher of the previous book in Israel, Shmuel Rosner, called us after October 7th, and he said, Einat, you and Adi are two of the very few people who can say, tragically and sadly, we told you so. So I want you to write a book that reflects, the book came out in Israel in 2018, that reflects everything you've learned since and kind of looks at October 7th through that prism. And essentially, the book includes much of the previous book of the War of Return on the history of the conflict and the Palestinian refugee issue. But what it leans into much more here is, first of all, now we clearly call this ideology, we've given it a name, Palestinianism. We say that Palestinianism is the ideology and identity that connects the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and millions in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and their collaborators around the world in 4 core tenets. From the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and we are therefore perpetual refugees until return. And what we make clear is that return is synonymous with the non-existence of a Jewish state. It's not some innocent feeling of loss of a home. We show how October 7th was carried out in the name of the vision of return. We explain why the euphoria on that day was not they were breaking out of some prison. We know there was a lie. We saw it as soon as the military entered Gaza. What they saw on the GoPro cameras streamed on their social media on October 7th was the realization of a vision that they've been groomed for decades in the UNRA schools, with that idea that this will happen, and they saw it happen. The book actually opens with 2 pages before the introduction of quotes by Sinwar and Hamas. You mentioned that I was in the Israeli intelligence in my military service. It was in the 90s. When I finished my military service, I thought that we could actually close down Israel's intelligence agencies, or most of them, and do something much simpler. Listen to what the Arabs say. They have a tendency to tell us. We just go, no, they don't mean it. I've invented a word for it, West-plaining. West-plaining is when Western diplomats, journalists, academics explain away what Palestinians inconveniently say. Apropos, in 2020, I think, there were these, 2019, there were these marches of return, right? The marches of return in Gaza. They were marching towards Israel, not towards Egypt. And those were called the marches of return. They were very clear. Comes a journalist. He does this video interview with those marching. And he tells them, what are you marching for? And they're saying, from the river to the sea. They're pointing to Israel. They're saying, this is ours. We're going to take it back, right? This is way before October 7th. A 15-year-old says, I'm from village so-and-so. Now, he's 15. He was born in Gaza, lived there all his lives. He's not from village so-and-so, but that's what he says. That's in Israel. They all say the same things. The journalist turns to the camera and says, they're protesting the dire conditions in Gaza. And I'm like, it's the one thing they didn't say. But it's inconvenient. So again, we tell a story of misery, of you have to understand. I always bring this piece of data. On the eve of October 7th, the Human Development Index of Gaza, not Gaza and the West Bank, just Gaza, was better than 90 countries in the world. They did not carry October 7th because of misery. They carried it in the name of an ideology. So the book really shows how this ideology was built, how it became tragically the identity of an entire people, making it, I think, the only people in the world whose identity is not about building for themselves, but about destroying what others have built, and it's ultimately a tragedy for all. And the book shows how this identity has been fueled and funded by so-called Western do-gooders. And ultimately, that the path to peace depends on this ideology of Palestinianism dying. I say that the ideology of Palestinianism has to be killed, the ideology, not the people, so that the people, Jews and Arabs, can finally live. And this is what the book is about.
And when will it come out in English?
So, again, we're working with Elon Levy, who translated the first book, to finish translating the second book, I hope in a few months.
Good. To the war, just a few more questions and then we'll go to the audience. The war in Gaza. When I was there last week, almost universal message is bring the hostages home. 70-80% of the population is saying this. Of course, it's a complete inconsistency with the other aim of the war of destroying Gaza. It's very hard to see how the two can be reconciled, but nevertheless, everybody's saying it. And I'm just interested in your sort of views. How can this sort of come to an end? Or some sort of compromise in the interim?
So one of the themes that we highlight in the book, and that's why I think so much is at stake right now, is a theme that we argue has perpetuated the conflict. We call it, the Jews are never allowed to win, the Arabs are never allowed to lose, and certainly never allowed to acknowledge defeat. You know, sometimes people treat this conflict as if it's like some irrational cycle of violence, right? These barbarians and savages who just are engaged in this cycle of violence. And I'm like, no, it's actually incredibly logical. The conflict continues because every time that the Arabs in general, but especially the Palestine Arabs, when they go to a war of annihilation, and there's never been any other kind, they make it very clear what their goals are. Whenever they go to a war of no Jewish state and fail, they pay no consequences. Actually, every time they are salvaged from that defeat to be told, you didn't lose. No. Your victory is merely delayed. So try again. And they're logical people, so they try again. That's why the conflict continues. Because every time, this is why I focused so much of my working life on UNRA, because UNRA sits at the original sin of telling the Arab refugees, rather than telling them, you just waged a stupid war, you could have had another Arab state living next to a rump Jewish state, but no, it was more important for you to ensure that the Jews have zero, and you failed and became refugees, but it's over. You're now going to be Jordanians and Egyptians and Syrian and Lebanese, and it's over. Rather than getting that message, they were told, no. Keep yourselves as refugees forever, this idea of return, and try again, which is what they've been doing ever since. Now, when Hamas and many others took people from their beds on a Shabbat morning, they did not take the people in order to free butchers from Israeli prisons. That was more like the cherry on the cake, that was nice to have. They took the hostages in order to ensure that they end this process with no consequences. And here it's important to emphasize. When I say that to date, they have not paid the consequences of October 7th, people raise eyebrows. They're like, the ruin in Gaza, the people killed. I'm like, true, but from the perspective of those who committed the massacre, those are not consequences. And again, the Arabs do say what they mean. So just a few weeks ago, there was one of the Hamas leaders said, the houses that were destroyed we will rebuild, the people who were killed we will give birth to more. He said, that's not a price. Those are not consequences. If all of this ends with them in control of the entire territory of the Strip, whether directly or through some lie of a government of technocrats, the billions continue to flow, then from their perspective, this has been a great success, and they can now try again. So the question is, when Israelis say, we want back the remaining hostages, and we want them in a deal, it's very rarely that they're being asked, do you want the hostages? And this is what Hamas and many others did. They forced the Jewish people and Israelis into a Sophie's choice, basically saying, the price of getting the hostages, the remaining hostages, is that we get to try again. And I think it's rarely presented in those terms, and it is a Sophie's choice. I will have to say, I do think we have, and by the way, apropos international law, if I had more time with your foreign minister, after presenting the big picture, I would deal specifically. Not only does Israel abide by international law, Israel abides by invented rules that are made for no one else. I have a colleague with whom I love to write. His name is Dr. Shani Moore. He wrote a great piece called A Special Dictionary for Israel. And it's all about how every word, from occupation to apartheid to genocide, has been reworked so that it could be applied to Israel. And whenever I always post one of Shani's articles, I always say that Shani has a very annoying tendency to insist that international standards be standards, in the sense that these are invented rules. From the beginning, for example, it was somehow understood that Israel has to wage the war under 3 conditions. Gaza's territory remains intact. No allowing the population to leave, right? In every other conflict, it's let the people leave their war zone. And here it's, if Israel wants them to leave, it's ethnic cleansing. If they stay, it's genocide. Again, a completely invented rule. And the third is that Israel has to supply its enemy while it remains its enemy, refuses to surrender, and holds the hostages. And again, the enemy is not just Hamas. If we want to use a linguistic term like Nazi Germany, the enemy is Palestinianist Gaza. Again, the euphoria was of all of Gaza. They believed in the idea. Some of them are turning against Hamas because Hamas seems to be failing in realizing Palestinianism. They're not turning against Palestinianism, against the idea of no Jewish state. So I believe that we should insist that we get to wage war not under invented rules, but under the normal, standard rules, which is you get to take territory, your enemy has to pay with territory, your enemy has to surrender, and you don't have to supply your enemy. And we know that Hamas typically was willing to release hostages whenever it felt pressure on those issues, on when people from the north were pushed to the south, when it didn't have enough supplies. And basically what the world is doing is taking away all of Israel's levers, the levers that could have brought back the hostages much earlier, normalize the fact that Israel has to negotiate for them. From the beginning, I screamed about it. Now it's become so normal that it's weird. But in what world is it okay that you go, you invade, you kidnap people from their beds on a Shabbat morning, and then Israel, please negotiate? Again, in a normal world, we would have had leaders saying, Israel owes you nothing, give them back. Israel doesn't have to supply Palestinians to Gaza. Israel can take as much territory. Israel can push the population south. By the way, hey, Egypt, there's a border with Gaza. I call it the disappearing border with Gaza. You know, Egypt, you have a responsibility based on treaties to allow people to go, to escape a war zone. We are not only forced into a Sophie's choice, we are forced with all the levers that would have allowed us to both win the war clearly and retrieve the hostages much sooner. All of these were taken from us. And still I insist that this is a war that cannot end with a draw. Too much has happened, and we cannot allow it to be just more brutal, more intense round in Gaza. This has to be a moment where Israel insists that Palestinianism as an ideology is defeated. And you know, when I told people, people over when I said, you know, the ideology has to be defeated, people say, you can't defeat ideologies. I'm like, I'm sorry. Ideologies are defeated and replaced all the time. We believe in things we didn't believe 20 years ago. We look with smugness at what people believed 50 years ago. So then when I make this argument, people tell me, but can you defeat an ideology with violence? And my answer is, heck yeah, because what happens with violence? Because people make this weird argument. They're like, what Israel is doing in Gaza will further radicalize the Palestinians. And I remember when I first heard this argument, and I was like, I don't know how much more they could be radicalized. I'm like, this is it. And it comes from this bizarre notion, which again is empirically untrue, that I've come to call trauma determinism, that violence only ever begets violence. If that were true, we would all be dead. Clearly, that's not true. The question is, what happens when you face disaster? Both individually and collectively, moments of disaster and ruin and failure can become moments of growth, transformation. Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, they certainly suffered violence, ruin, destruction. But they were not told, no, you didn't really lose, one day you'll win. They had to unconditionally surrender. You know, a few months ago, I was in a conference in Paris on how to make peace. I don't know how many of you saw the movie Back to the Future, but you remember the scenes when Marty begins to understand that it's the year 1955. He sees a paper, he goes into the diner, he's like, okay, I'm in the 50s. It begins to dawn on him. So I'm sitting there in this conference in France, and they say, when are you going back to the negotiating table? You need to negotiate a two-state solution. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I'm in the 90s? I think I'm in the 90s. It was as if nothing has happened. So then the moderator, she asks, how can the EU help? It was one of the closing questions. And I don't know what your experience is. Typically when Europeans ask this question, it's with this smugness of how can we, peace-loving, enlightened people, help you savages solve your problems? So I tell her, you know what? What would really be helpful if the EU remembered how it became the EU? Because you didn't become the EU because you negotiated. You became the EU because some ruthless leaders of the Allies understood that World War II, unlike the first one, cannot end with an armistice, which then Germany will say, hey, my victory was stolen and all that. They understood that World War II has to end with a clear victory for the Allies, clear defeat for the Axis, and they need to know that they lost. And they need to acknowledge it. A book that I've been using a lot after October 7th is about Imperial Japan, and it's called Embracing Defeat. It's all about how Japan became from a country of suicide bombers, so to speak, to a country of Pikachu. So it's, the transformation is possible, but you need to really face the disaster and ruin and understand the connection between the ideology that has led you to that ruin. And what I fear at this moment is we might miss this moment of destruction and ruin, and I'm not denying. There is destruction and ruin in Gaza. But the question is, will they again get the message, you had nothing to do with it, not your fault? You hear it already. The war that Israel opened on October 7th, right? That's what you hear. If they continue to hear the message, it's not your fault, it has nothing to do with you, it's big, bad, evil Israel, there will be no transformation. The only transformation, if they finally realize that there's an actual connection of cause and effect between their choice, and it's an ideological choice, to spend a century trying to destroy what the Jews have built rather than build for themselves, and that the ruin of Gaza is the logical consequence of that choice. And this is a moment that we must ensure really, really ends with Palestinianism defeated and knowing that it was defeated.
Thank you. Well, Unfortunately, this is not the Joe Rogan show, so we can't go on for 3 hours, and I'm not Joe Rogan. We would love to keep speaking, there's just so many more things that we can think about and talk about, but I think we better end the Q&A there. I wanted to take a brief moment to thank, of course, everyone at AIJAC for organising this event. There's 4 events in Melbourne and Sydney over the next week, so it's been a big program. Thanking you, of course, for being here.